funding the research that went into this. Again, my name is Vincent Artman. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography. And over the summer, I had hoped to be in Kyrgyzstan studying this Manas, who's sort of the great hero of the Kyrgyz nation. But you know, for various reasons, life gets in the way, funding doesn't come through. So I stayed in the US and I studied that Manas instead, which is the American Transit Center near Bishkek. That is sort of a major, excuse me if my voice is going out, I don't know what's going on. It's sort of one of the major logistics hubs that was supporting operations in Afghanistan. And because there's two of us, I'm going to try to zip through this as quickly as possible. But this base has been in the news quite a bit because it's sort of this on again, off again, on again. Are they keeping it? Are they kicking us out? Sort of project. And as of now, unless I've missed something in the last like 2 minutes, it's off again, and we're supposed to be out by the end of 2014. But you know, who knows what's going on. So just basic information about the transit center. Again, it's named after the epic hero Manas, who was that great-looking guy on a horse, sort of riding off into the distance on that first slide. And it was opened in 2001, around the same time as the Karshi-Khanabad base in Uzbekistan, and it was to support the war in Afghanistan. And it was part of a new strategy called the lily pad strategy, and the idea of this was to basically open bases that were quote-unquote small footprints. So rather than, you know, having everything being supplied by the United States and sort of a big, huge permanent base, maybe, I guess, Okinawa might be an example, I don't know. These were supposed to be small footprint. They were supposedly going to be something that could be easily dismantled, relatively speaking, not intended to be permanent. And they would rely very heavily on local contractors and that sort of thing. And to get the base there, this is Askar Akayev, the former president, and it was a political coup for Akayev because Kyrgyzstan is not a rich country. It has been through you know, a lot of political turmoil, and Tajikistan really, really, really wanted an American base to be put at Kulyab. But Rumsfeld and I guess other people high on up decided that Manas would be a better choice, and they awarded Akayev the Manas base instead, and they gave Tajikistan a bridge into Afghanistan, which has been problematic for a number of reasons. We won't go into that. And this was a political coup because this was a time when Akayev's popularity was sagging. He was quite popular in the 1990s, but as the 2000s rolled in, charges of corruption, that he was becoming increasingly authoritarian, that his style of politics was really just favoring his family and his sort of political clan. These charges were becoming increasingly prevalent around this time, and so getting this air base, which was an economic gold mine, brought to Kyrgyzstan right near the capital city was really a major deal because the Kyrgyz government, which needs money, was able to charge pretty huge amounts of rent for this, and the amount kind of went up, and over time they tried to bargain it and get more for it. Obviously it employs lots of locals. Part of this lily pad strategy was to employ as many local people as they could and get local contractors to supply fuel and this sort of thing. And there was a lot of charges that there was corruption involved, so a lot of the money that was going into the base was then supposedly, allegedly coming out of the base into the pockets of people like that. So again, it was a boost to his legitimacy at a time when he really, really needed it. And it was also part of the war on terror. Central Asian states saw this as an opportunity, saw the war on terror and the war in Afghanistan as an opportunity to cozy up with the United States and deal with problems that they've been dealing with already. So this is Tohir Yaldashayev, and he was the leader of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, which launched some terrorist attacks in Uzbekistan, and the IMU actually invaded southern Kyrgyzstan in kind of around the turn of the millennium as well. And both, I think, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan saw the idea that, they could open these bases and they could make some security arrangements with the United States is ultimately beneficial to them because they would align themselves with us and we would help them get rid of these guys. And Akayev himself basically says this in his book, actually called The Manas Epic and the Kyrgyz Statehood. He says, Kyrgyzstan immediately expressed its principled support to the purposes and tasks of the coalition. Appropriate practical measures which correspond to the national interests of the country were undertaken immediately after 9/11 by allowing the deployment of airplanes and coalition military forces on our territory. We had no right to be merely observers. We came to these decisions consciously, and they fully reflect our principles and beliefs. And at another point in the book, he actually likens joining the coalition in the war on terror to joining the anti-Nazi coalition in World War II. Mere rhetoric, I don't know. But at the very least, he was consciously aligning Kyrgyzstan with the United States. So, importantly, this is the northern distribution network. This is how a lot of the men and materials get from elsewhere into Afghanistan. And you can see transit center at Manas is right there, and the Karshi Khanabad was sort of in here. And K2, as it was called, got closed down in 2005 after the Bush administration protested against the Uzbek massacre of people at Andajan. So that left this as sort of one of the major hub, perhaps, in Central Asia to get things in here. So obviously, from a logistical standpoint, from a geopolitical standpoint, it was pretty important, and still is. Okay, there's another map. So there's Manas and K2 is right down there, or was. And there's that Kyanj bridge that Tajikistan got. So the question then is, if this was so important, and this was such an economic goldmine for the Kyrgyz government and for the people there, why are they on again, off again, on again, off again, and now off again for sure, closing this thing down? Because it brings, as I said, massive benefits to the Kyrgyz economy. The government itself got at least, at baseline, $390 million from the US government, and probably more. The contractors made millions. The people who work there, again, the Kyrgyz economy is not particularly dynamic, and unemployment is high, and so the fact that they can get reasonably good paying jobs at Manas was a boon for anyone living near Bishkek. And the United States conducted a lot of infrastructure improvements around the base itself, particularly on the runway and this sort of thing, because they have to support these gigantic jets and things. So there were a lot of benefits that came in, as well as the sort of benefits of closer cooperation geopolitically with the United States, and so forth. But the problem is there was a lot of controversy, and a lot of this controversy is alleged. A lot of it is sort of whisper campaigns, but those kinds of things still have an effect on sort of mind share. People, whether it's true or not, still believe it. And so there was a lot of belief that a lot of this money was flowing from the base, again, into the hands of insiders in the government, particularly Akayev's family. Which, maybe this is inherent in the small footprint strategy in the first place, because you're kind of relying on local contractors, and this does create more opportunities for graft. And of course, the argument is, well, no laws were actually violated, no US laws, but it did nevertheless aggravate sort of the highly charged atmosphere around this base, because the corruption issues didn't disappear in the Tulip Revolution. So that's the Tulip Revolution, people smiling and waving and walking around. But Akayev was eventually replaced with this guy, Kurbanbek Bakiev, who himself, as you can see by his billboard being burned and defaced there, himself was not particularly popular and was also eventually thrown out of the government. But during the revolution, the status of the base and the perception that it was extremely corrupt played into the hands of the opposition. And they said, well, look, all of this money is not flowing into the hands of the people, it's flowing into the hands of this guy who we all hate anyway, so let's throw him out. So the base really became a symbol of the corruption of the Akayev regime. Of course, that didn't really change. As soon as Bakiev came in, he pretty much did the same thing, and he actually tried to jack up the rent prices and play a hard line with the United States. He didn't really succeed, but he tried it anyway. And he threatens to close the base, and a few people have written, for instance, that the base really during this period became what they say a milling method for the ruling elite, aka just a way for them to kind of have money flowing into their pockets at all times. So these are just some examples of some random whisper campaigns. So at one point within the last year or so, the Bishkek market suddenly gets flooded with a bunch of choice cuts of beef and expensive lobster, which is not something that you would normally expect to find in Bishkek. And there was some speculation from angry local merchants who thought, well, our prices are being undercut by all this really cheap beef, that maybe it was coming from the base. Nothing was proved, no charges were filed or anything, but that was the perception, that all of this yummy lobster and all this beef and stuff was actually kind of making its way off the base, smuggled out by mafiosi or something and entering the local market that way. More problematic was the idea that as these huge planes, and you might not be able to see it, that's a fuel tanker there, as these planes are landing, sometimes they jettison whatever fuel they have left. And a lot of people were angered by the fact that, this was coming off and landing in their fields or near their homes or whatever. And again, whether it was happening, whether it was not, I don't think anyone ever really seriously looked into it. But there were complaints, and those complaints fell on deaf ears. And there was this idea that maybe the US doesn't really care so much about the people there, they just want the base. And so you started hearing, rumors that, well, it's an arrogant imperialist country that's just taking our land and using our base, and it's causing all of these problems for hardworking Kyrgyz people. The Thepano of Controversy was another sort of nail in the coffin. At one point, there was a driver for a fuel contractor, and there was an altercation, and he was killed by an American serviceman. And although the incident was handled according to American procedure, he was made to come back to the United States, and there was an inquiry. A lot of Kyrgyz nevertheless felt that justice wasn't done, and that the outcome of the case, because I don't think the guy actually got any jail time, showed that the American soldiers really could get away with whatever they wanted, and that, again, this proved that, that we were arrogant imperialists and we didn't really care about Kyrgyz. So again, this was another incident that really, for a lot of people, and certainly not all, but for a lot of people, brought the base itself under a dark cloud. Moreover, there were a number of jet crashes. Most recent happened in May of this year, in fact, and that's the crash site near Bishkek. Initial reports said that the US was being high-handed and wouldn't let the Kyrgyz investigate and get near the crash site or anything else. Later reports from both sides denied those allegations, but it's kind of one of those things like, the front page news is really negative, and then there's a retraction on the last page, and I think the news that, we weren't letting people in, again, affected people's sort of perceptions, and then the denials that this even happened sort of got lost in the news cycle. And there have been occasional collisions on the runway with civilian jets at Manas as well, which has kind of ticked off a lot of people. Which has led to Yankees get out of Kyrgyzstan. So there have been intermittent protests, and again, all sorts of allegations of really crazy stuff, human trafficking, drug smuggling, that there's nuclear weapons there pointed at Iran. And a lot of these come from random sort of protest groups, but as we know, sometimes the smallest groups are the loudest groups, and you can read about this stuff in the international press, and Radio Free Europe or Eurasia Net, or any of sort of the major sort of daily news publications about what's going on in this part of the world. These kinds of protests get a lot of attention, and so you hear all about this kind of stuff. And if we're hearing about it here, people are hearing about it there as well. You have members of the government arguing that, well, you know, we had one plane crash and luckily it landed in the middle of a field somewhere, but what if another one crashed in that power station that's just a few kilometers away? Or what if it landed on, you know, a village? Or what if it landed on Bishkek itself? What if, what if, what if? And kind of oddly, in a reversal of the, you know, kind of Akayev era commitment to the war on terror as being in the best interests of Kyrgyzstan, Rosa Altunbayeva, who was the interim president after Bakiev was forced out, actually argued in an interview that there was a terrorism concern and that the base being there actually attracted terrorists who might blow things up in Bishkek and, you know, cause all kinds of havoc. Obviously, nothing ever happened, but again, it was sort of an absolute reversal of the old standpoint that getting the base there was actually going to help fight terrorism. So all of these things contributed to people like this, you know, getting out there and protesting, and hey, Yankee, where's your conscience, where's your responsibility, where is your responsibility, decency, where is your humanism, your arrogance is insulting us, we see your arrogance and patched up democracy, pay for the damages, go home now. And you can see both of these are from the same protests, and I don't know anything about that particular NGO, but they're obviously advertising themselves. And one of the loudest protest groups is Jean Ere, which is a youth group. Obviously, these men are not members of the youth group, but it still goes to show that at least some people, and loud people who are standing out on the streets with big signs, are sort of opposed to the US presence there. But that's only part of the story, of course, because 50% of people in Kyrgyzstan still see the base as a net positive. And, you know, for a lot of reasons. You've got buff, you know, servicemen with footballs and things, distributing them to, you know, little kids dressed in Santa Claus hats. And, you know, this actually creates a lot of goodwill. Kyrgyzstan's a poor country, and the idea that, you know, American servicemen are coming out and building schools and helping kids and, you know, you can't read that, it says $5,000, and I think there was another case where they got another $10,000 or $15,000 for you know, the base. These things do create a positive impact. And again, we keep saying employment, employment, employment. People in Kyrgyzstan need money and they need jobs. AmCham, which I think we're going to hear about soon when Alex talks, also is involved in Kyrgyzstan, and again creating outreach, creating a more positive view of the base by bringing local business leaders to the base and sort of showing them around and saying, look, you know, we're not smuggling lobster and there's no nuclear missiles here, and that sort of thing. And then these guys again. But geopolitics. I'm a geographer, and you know, whisper campaigns and choice cuts of beef are all important. But you know, from a geopolitical standpoint, I think this is really the main driver of what's going on. The growing American presence in Kyrgyzstan was seen as a direct threat to, you know, Russia's control over the near abroad and all this kind of thing. Since 2003, so not too long after we opened the base, Russia got a lease to open a base at Kant, which is kind of on the other side. I have a map of Bishkek. And this presence is actually going to be expanded in the next few years. And Kyrgyzstan is not kicking them out, and in fact they're saying, bring in your strategic bombers, and you know, we're going to let you stay here until 2032 at the very least. And Kyrgyzstan is also part of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is Russia-dominated, and their military is also very much accustomed to using Russian equipment, which, again, if you're a poor country like Kyrgyzstan and you need to buy new equipment, you're going to buy equipment from the person who you're part of a security treaty with and whose weaponry is probably going to come cheaper, and you don't have to be retrained to use. So here you can see a smiling Akayev with a not so happy looking Putin walking around at Khan Air Base, he looks very pleased with himself. He looks like younger than he does today. Here you can see Kant and Manas is sort of right here. So they're actually really close together. And like I said, they're set to stay there until 2032 at the least, and they've signed some agreements, and there's probably going to be, you know, large strategic bombers hanging out there very soon if they're not already there. So these ties with Russia, as I argued, are really important. Kyrgyzstan's military, their economy, their energy needs, all of these are dependent on close ties with Russia. In fact, Kyrgyz Gas, the Kyrgyz gas company, is now owned by Gazprom, and it was purchased for $1. The argument, of course, was that this was intended to alleviate problems delivering Gazprom gas to Kyrgyz gas through nasty old Kazakhstan, but really what it does is it puts Kyrgyzstan at Russia's mercy, as Ukraine sadly is finding out these days. When Gazprom kind of controls the spigot, they also control the tune. Again, Kyrgyzstan's economy is not particularly strong, and they've taken a lot of loans, and Russia has sort of dangled the carrot of loan forgiveness or forbearance if Manas is closed down. And again, on and off again sort of thing. And really, to me, perhaps the most important thing is that Kyrgyzstan is a country that has a lot of mountains and has a lot of rivers. And a lot of those rivers serve downstream users like Uzbekistan. And Kyrgyzstan has a lot to gain economically, and it has a lot to gain geopolitically from developing hydroelectric dams along those rivers. It can supply more of its own power, and it gains a lot of traction over those downstream users who have, in fact, resisted and threatened, in some cases, negative reactions if Kyrgyzstan develops those resources, which it can't afford to do in any case. But Russian support and Russian investment not only could get those projects going again, but it would also serve to counterbalance the threats from those downstream users who might otherwise be able to push Kyrgyzstan around a little bit. So here's, I'm sorry, it's extremely fuzzy, but you can see that the Sirdarya River flows right into the Fergana Valley in Uzbekistan, and there's several dams under construction along that river that I don't personally think that Kyrgyzstan could probably afford to complete on its own, but there are a number of them along here, and their completion would seriously impact Kyrgyzstan's economy and its sort of regional clout. So the future of the base is uncertain. Well, not really. It's supposed to close by the end of 2014, and again, unless during the course of my lecture it's changed, I think that's probably still the case. There have actually been some interesting reports that the Chinese have sort of pressured and said, well, we're right next door to Kyrgyzstan, and we can, help your economy out if you close things down. All sides, again, have denied this, and this, when I was doing my research, was really the motif of everything that I was reading. Was like somebody whispered something, and then everybody else officially denied it. So it's oftentimes a little bit difficult to figure out quite what's going on. President Atambayev, even though he's fully aware that the loss of the base is going to leave a gigantic hole in the Kyrgyz economy. Those jobs are gone, the rent money is gone, the contracts are gone, the corruption is gone. But he just says, well, this is going to be compensated from other projects. And he seems pretty confident of that, which leads me to believe that some of these geopolitical factors and the ties with Russia are in fact what is driving this, because he seems pretty convinced that this isn't really going to hurt that much. There has been some talk of turning Manas into a major logistics hub for trade from China to other parts of the world. Again, there hasn't been a whole lot of development on that, but that might be one way of potentially making up for some of this loss. And I think it also might show the limitations of the lily pad strategy, because despite the best intentions of leaving a small footprint in Kyrgyzstan, and for that matter in Uzbekistan, both K2 and Manas basically became political footballs because of local politics that the US didn't necessarily want to be part of, and that they didn't really have a lot of control over. When you have one side saying it's corruption and the other side saying no, or you have beef and lobster magically appearing out of somewhere, whether or not the commanders on the base are even aware of that, or whether they have any power to control that, they're still subject to those perceptions, which if 50% of the people in Kyrgyzstan are feeling positive about Manas, it also means 50% aren't, because of scandal. So, sorry, that was sort of a rush through a really complex topic. Again, I'd like to thank the FMSO, I'd like to thank Kyrgyz, I'd like to thank the Department of Geography here for giving me a home. So, thank you very much.
Folks, I'd like to ask that you make notes, keep the questions that you might have in your mind, and we're going to do a joint Q&A after Alex gets done with his presentation. It should come up after you go to slideshow.
Okay, my name is Alexander Melin. I'm a 2008 Kyrgyz MA grad, and I'm currently in my last year of law school at KU. And this summer, I worked on a FMSO fellowship at the American Chamber of Commerce in Georgia, in Tbilisi, Georgia. And today, I want to give kind of an overview of some of the broad legal issues that are affecting business, and then to some extent charities and nonprofits. Some of this is going to be kind of general, and then I'll kind of examine some of the topics that I looked at in depth during my time there, specifically per diem expenses, representational cost expenses, and the charitable giving and grant giving frameworks. Sorry, this might be a little bit arcane and perhaps boring, but to begin with, Georgia belongs to European civil law tradition, which I mentioned this just now because it has some influence on the judiciary in the sense that the judges there tend not to be the same kind of legal experts that you might have in the United States or other common law countries. So AmCham, where I was employed at, Vincent mentioned this briefly. It's basically its core mission is to improve the business environment in Georgia and promote economic growth. And to that extent, it engages in policy, supporting policy papers, lobbying. We helped organize the jointly with the American Embassy in Tbilisi. We hosted the 4th of July celebration there. Why should we care about Georgia's legal environment? Of course, economic growth, especially in the Caucasus, is one of the keys here to regional stability, and the legal environment plays a huge role in that. In particular, when we look at Russia's growth this year, there's been forecasts all over the place. Earlier this year, back in June, World Bank was speculating that there might be 4% growth this year. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development now says it would be 2%. I saw just yesterday some people are now expecting that there will only be 1.3% growth rate, and a lot of this is due to a decline in foreign direct investment. And when I say decline in foreign direct investment, it's not necessarily there's capital outflows out of Georgia, but year on year there's less FDI that's coming in, especially Western FDI. And I particularly mentioned this, like in the first quarter of 2013, the largest actual, the source of FDI was actually Japan. And when we look at the second quarter, the U.S. was in 5th place, behind Turkey, Azerbaijan, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, I believe. So, the people are kind of worried about the environment there. But Georgia still has a good legal and regulatory framework. Bridget Brink, who's the deputy head of mission at the U.S. Embassy, she came and gave a talk with a AmCham roundtable, and she said this, that we don't think anything's fundamentally changed in Georgia with the election of Ivanishvili. But a lot of investors, I've seen so much in the press that they just don't know who this guy is. They don't know what's going to happen, and especially not only him but his party. A lot of people in Tbilisi were kind of anecdotally referring to his party as the Dreamers because they, Georgian dreamed that they had their heads in the clouds and weren't really thinking clearly. And I'll, discuss it here in a second. Georgia has moved up in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business rankings from 2012 to 2013 by 1 slot, and this is actually a very, very good rating. Part of this is actually they adopted the alternative tax audit system, which has kind of given business some confidence that they're not going to be unfairly discriminated against by the courts, because what would happen before, there would be a tax ruling against a company, and the courts were not essentially competent to handle these matters, and as a result of that, they would just rely on whatever the prosecutor told them and rule against the business. So again, as I've kind of alluded to, some of the legal concerns are based on political uncertainty, concerns about populist measures. You know, Georgian Dreams Coalition, the Georgian Dream Coalition's legislative agenda, it really wasn't clear. And so, you know, a lot of people are asking, you know, what's going to happen now? You know, and as it did turn out, they had some legal reforms that were not exactly that great. So, this summer, Georgia passed a new labor code, which was very comprehensive, and AmCham lobbied for a lot of amendments, some of which were accepted. But this is an area where business in general is not satisfied with this new labor code, and actually the U.S. government, as of August, was seeking to give a grant of $2 million to Georgia in order to actually develop their labor laws better. And why is the new labor code harmful to business? Well, first, it requires that anyone who's going to work for more than 3 months has to have a written contract that will have all the essential terms. These essential terms cannot be changed without the consent of the employee. And also, it essentially eliminates at-will firing. So Kansas is an at-will state where you can fire someone for any reason or no reason at all. Now in Georgia, with the new labor code, it's impossible to, well, it's not impossible, but except in cases of gross malfeasance, you're not going to be able to easily fire someone. Furthermore, employees are restricted to 40 hours a week of work time, and that cannot be contracted around. You know, even if the person's being substantially paid more, and that's not exactly clear. Also, furthermore, anyone who's performing anything that can be considered work has to have a contract or be paid, and this has caused some concern because BJI Legal's Lasha Goga-Baridze, he gave a presentation, talked about this at length, and there's a lot of concerns that this might actually make it illegal to have unpaid interns, and it also makes volunteers in things like charity organizations or NGOs. It makes the status of these volunteers unclear, whether or not they have to be paid, whether or not they have to be hired and fired. And a lot of people see this as kind of it's kind of a populist. That's how I describe it. It was a populist outgrowth of the Georgian Dream Party, and the Georgian Dream Coalition. They proposed a banking law that almost made it to Ivanishvili's desk before it was tabled in July. And that was very problematic because it was essentially going to eliminate the ability of banks to foreclose on mortgages until after the October election. Well, people didn't take into account what this would do to the credit markets. I mean, if a bank cannot actually know that it can kick people off a property, that it gives a loan, it gives a loan based on that property, it's just going to tie up your lending. And so, it was only actually after Transparency International's Matthias Hutter actually called Ivanishvili's office after the second reading and told him, explain why you need to kill this bill, did it get tabled? I mean, because this could have done a lot of damage to their economy. And another issue that is a pretty prominent one right now is under Mikhail Saakashvili's government, there was upwards of $4 billion in what are being called illegal property transfers or coerced property transfers, where there was, let's say, a prosecutor goes to someone and says, we want you to gift your land to the government and we will drop criminal charges against you. And this has affected some AmCham members, and this is actually a really huge issue. There's something like 13,000 pending criminal cases with regard to this in Tbilisi, which, essentially the judiciary can't handle it. And a lot of these claims on the property, these are going back to 2005, and they're time barred by the statute of limitations. And I bring this up, one, because it's kind of an important issue, and it's something that AmCham has a grant to study from the Eurasia Partnership Foundation, and they have some lawyers looking into this and following these kind of trials. But you can get around the statute of limitations by showing that it was a criminal action, and in that way you can, the statute of limitations, what we say, it tolls, and you can still bring suit. But I mentioned this because when I originally went to Georgia, I wanted to do research on the limitations period in the Convention of Sales and limitation period convention on sales of goods, which essentially is a statute of limitations treaty that says that if you sell goods to Georgia and you're like an American company, that they only have a limited number of years to bring suit against you for a problem with the goods. Well, I found out when I talked to the CLT committee members, they really didn't want to put the idea in the government's head of increasing statutes of limitations because of this. So as a result of that, I kind of changed my research focus. There's some other issues too. Agriculture, there's been recently a ban on foreign land ownership, which might run afoul of actually WTO obligations. Exports with Russia are concerned. Iran, that might be going away as a concern, but there's a lot of concerns about transshipment through Georgia that American business needed to be concerned about. We actually even had an Iranian agent from an export company who came to AmCham and essentially asked us to legally transship, if we'd be interested in doing this. So, we politely escorted him out, and now there's a lot of concerns about the United States getting in on a foreign trade agreement with Georgia because of the EU's movement in this area. And actually, just on I think the 14th and 15th of November, Sarah Williamson, who's actually the overall head of president of the AmCham, was meeting with senators in Washington about that. So that might be something that we'll see in the not too far future. So what I ended up researching was a couple of topics that the Commercial Law and Tax Committee were interested in. And one of these was per diem and travel expenses in Georgia. So what a per diem is, for those of you who are not familiar with this, when you go on a business trip, you're entitled to reimbursement for costs. And certain businesses, service sector jobs, that this can actually be a significant amount of money. And I don't think that the legislation in Georgia was necessarily poor, but it's, they have other more pressing things on their plate, and this isn't something that they've really gotten to. So under Georgian law, the Georgian finance minister actually issues a list of per diem rates and lodging rates. So this hadn't been updated since 2005. It has not kept up with inflation, cost of living changes. And it required hard copy documents that had to be directly invoiced to a business, which can be very difficult sometimes for an employee. Employees like, if he needs to get a hotel receipt issued to his business rather than to him. Furthermore, there is no provision in the law for in-city transportation in the incidentals. So like for taxis or bus. And it's pretty much impossible in Georgia to get receipts for a taxi, let's say. However, you could still get reimbursed for airfare, let's say, if you needed to fly from Istanbul to Tbilisi, for example. And when I say per diem costs here, they were not reasonably linked to actual costs and too low. The per diem for Tbilisi was 20 lari, which is something like less than $15, which I went to numbeo.com and actually calculated, what your lodging expenses would be, what your food expenses would be, and I mean, this isn't even enough for anyone to even eat a single good meal. And, in researching this, there's not a whole lot of research on this, but in Azerbaijan, they had problems. They actually had really low per diems before, which had people funneling money into kind of fake accounts to pay for their employees, and then what did they do with these fake accounts? Then they started, misappropriating money, and it became a real bad corruption problem.
That's how you do it.
So yeah, don't get the idea. And this, in Georgia, if you're providing beyond the per diem rate, you're getting charged 20% salary tax. So if you're paying your employee to go on a business trip in more than 20 lari, they're getting taxed on that. So, it's just kind of unfair to business. And so I prepared a chart based on European community schedule for external aid projects, U.S. schedule, and Georgia schedule. You can kind of see what kind of disparities you have here. Where for example, Moscow. Sorry, it's kind of hard to see here. Moscow. For lodging and expenses, you're looking at under $300. Upwards of 500 or more than that for U.S. and European community. And so, this kind of cross-section, Istanbul, Tbilisi, Baku, Berlin, DC, Moscow, New York. So when I was looking at this, I came to the conclusion that based on just cost of living increases and inflation since that time, the per diem rates for Georgia should be increased by about 5 times. And the rates for other locations should be increased because a lot of these had not been changed since 2007, 2008. Actually, most of them had not been changed. And there's no differentiation in the schedule between cities. So, like if you're going to Turkey and you're staying in a rural area versus staying in Istanbul, the disparity in the per diem, there in the United States there'll be a huge disparity because everyone knows that in Istanbul you're going to have more expenses. And Georgia essentially doesn't take that into consideration at all, except in the single case of Russia, where they have a separate rate for Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I understand that Russia is it's a low-income country, and they might not have the resources to allow people to take detailed data every year. But one idea here is that Georgia could average U.S. or European community rates or use another basket of nations per diems to make sure that this corresponds with reality. And also there's a requirement of hard copy, and I think that that's kind of unreasonable and that needs to be changed. So representational costs. This is something that our auditors were actually very concerned about, and this is something that affects service firms a lot more than manufacturing firms. So representational costs, in the United States context, this might include like wining and dining or promotional type things that businesses need to do, as a part of their business. And in a professional services firm, this might take up 4 or 5% of the entire budget. Whereas a company like Georgian American Alloys that produces a commodity, the rates they're not going to spend very much on representational expenses at all. And so luckily we have all the big 4 auditors are members of AmCham, so I was able to get kind of good information on this kind of stuff. And there's kind of 6 approaches to the expense topic worldwide, where some countries don't allow them to be deducted at all, some allow complete deductibility. And then what Georgia has is a hard cap where it's 1%. It's 1% of turnover. And in Armenia, it's 0.3% of turnover. And in Russia, it's 1.5% of labor costs. But this hard cap function, as far as I can tell, it's only restricted post-Soviet countries, Albania and the Philippines. Much more common is what the United States and a lot of European countries do, where they'll just say, 80% of representational costs across the board can be deducted. So that will take into account that representational costs, they might have some kind of personal component to them, but it's still enough to deter companies from spending wildly at the end of the year just to make up that 1% cap, because they know they can deduct it anyway. Again, 1% under the Georgian law, that's insufficient to cover the firm's representational expenses. I talked to Nelson Petrosyan at Grant Thornton, and he told me that their representational expenses were 4% of turnover. And one topic too that I didn't even really initially think about, but when I was talking to Tamara Gvaramadze at the Georgian Young Lawyers Association, NGOs cannot deduct representational expenses because it's not considered to be within the frame of economic activity. So if Georgian Young Lawyers Association wants to have a promotional event in Batumi, they have to just pay for that out of pocket, and why is that kind of important? Well, it stunts your NGO growth, your growth, and hurts NGOs. And as we'll see, the NGOs are kind of suffering in Georgia. So you have the similar kind of substantiation requirements that must be directly to the company, not the employee. And so, you know, when I was looking at all the different approaches, is kind of doing an analysis of what's the best practice here, I think honestly what Georgia should move to is a 5% deduction for all expenses, you know, maybe 75, 80%. What the Philippines does in order to protect service providers versus manufacturers of goods is they have a bifurcated system where a company that is like a service provider, like let's say a law firm, they can have 2% of their turnover can be deducted as a function, or their representational expenses. I'm sorry, I didn't say that exactly correctly, but 2% can be deducted. Where manufacturers of goods, they can deduct 1%, and then there's a sliding scale for countries or for companies in countries. There's a sliding scale for companies that engage in the sale of goods and services. You know, but again, this is something that, you know, I suggested to AmCham that they survey their members about, because there might be members that don't even reach this 1% threshold, and to them that would actually would hurt their business. You know, the absolute deductions, although Ukraine and Belarus do this, they tend to construe these very narrowly, and you know, the tax regime in a lower middle income country, as I say, with the history of corruption, is probably not a great idea. Again, NGOs, you know, token gifts, that would be a good idea to include in electronic invoicing. Okay, so charitable giving, this is probably what I spent the most time on there at AmCham. In the United States, you have a personal income tax deduction for giving to charity. And it is 10%, but in Georgia, there is no such benefit. And this has really stunted the charity sector in Georgia. There's only, although there's 10,000 registered NGOs, there's only 59, as of this summer, 59 registered charities in Georgia. And you know, charity status is not held by many organizations, even when they are eligible for it, because there's all these reporting requirements about what your activities are. There's vagueness about you know, what is actually required in these reports. And there's not really a charitable giving culture in Georgia. I talked to Matthias Hutter at Transparency International. I mean, he said he couldn't think of a time when he'd ever heard of a business or you know, business giving charity or even people doing it. I mean, if you want to construe charitable giving to include giving to the church, yes, there's a lot of giving to the Georgian Orthodox Church, but that doesn't have the same kind of you know, positive social benefits in terms of providing services to the public. You know, another big problem with the existing laws and nonprofits and charities, they can engage in auxiliary economic activities, but there's a certain point that people don't really know what that point is, but it changes you into a business. And so this affected the Georgian Young Lawyers Association, because they used to have paid trainings. And essentially, at some point, they were warned, you know, if you continue to do this, we're going to ask you to change your tax status. So what did they have to do? They had to actually create a second organization that was actually a business to avoid this problem. You know, and when you look at Europe, you know, a lot of charities engage in auxiliary economic activity. NGOs do it. They often get the majority of their funding from these kind of things, getting grants from the government also. So the NGO sector is unsustainable in Georgia, and it receives most of its funds from donors. There's a lot of things that are ending in Georgia right now. The G3 program, the Good Governance Georgia program, is ending. Oxfam Novi B, they left. Norlag left. I mean, and people are seeing the writing on the wall that you know, people didn't see the appeal to, they didn't see the need to appeal for donations or grants before, because they had so much largesse coming in. But now, you know, this money's drying up. And this NGO activity, you know, you would think that AmCham, as a business organization, would think, well, these NGOs, you know, they're going to keep, you know, they're going to hurt us in issues like labor or the environment or something. But, you know, the Transparency International, GPAC, there's a lot of NGO groups that are actually members of the American Chamber of Commerce, and you know, and we benefit from them, like on the issue of the banking law, where we were kind of caught asleep at the wheel that this banking law was going to get passed, and Transparency International was aware of it. Georgia also has a grant-giving law, and this is something that has affected companies like BP in Georgia, where BP has given more than $100 million in grants over the last 10 years, but they are subject to profit tax. And the only way they can do this is essentially by partnering with another third party, organization, because as a business, they are not permitted to give grants. And really, I've talked to people about this, and I know from someone who talked to the former Minister of Finance, they were essentially concerned about people setting up two things. They're concerned about people setting up sham corporations and getting deductions, and they're also concerned about money going into political campaigning. But Ivanishvili, a lot of people said, well, he just bought the election anyway, so why even bother with this anymore? And then there's also social enterprises, for-profit enterprises that can't get grants. And so, like, one example is there was a grant program to give rural women entrepreneurs small grants to promote business. And this is something that actually the Georgia government wanted to promote, but it still gets taxed at the 20% salary rate, even though it's a grant for a targeted purpose. Well, how does Georgia want to get around this? They say, well, for-profit entities can give grants to the state, and then we will manage this to make sure that there's not going to be political interference in our country and whatnot. No one wants to do that. And when I talked to Tamara Vadamadze at Jila, she told me that they actually, the Ministry of Justice actually had a juvenile justice program where they had something like $10 million in grants, and no one would take it. Because one of the things that was part of the grants was they had the ability to audit you at will. And no one wants to take that kind of money. So this is just one grant example. This is the National Museum in Tbilisi, and BP gave them a grant. So actually, it was introduced just before I left on August 29th. There was actually a bill on philanthropy, charity, and social enterprises that went into Parliament, and that bill, it has a lot of promise and kind of resolves some of these problems, and it also resolves the issues of volunteering under the Labor Code, whether or not volunteers can participate. However, this got shelved until after the election. I've been told that a bill has been passed, but I think the person who told me that is mistaken, and this is only concerning goods in kind to charities. That was passed in August, where before you couldn't deduct the value of services provided, let's say putting a roof on an orphanage, and now you can. So I'm not exactly sure where this is at. I've been trying to monitor this and see if the bill's been passed, but it hasn't. But the bill as it was in October, or not in October, beginning of September, it had a lot of problems because it was more than 90 pages long, and I hadn't been able to get a good translation of that in English, but I had found out from some people that had certain provisions that were just ridiculous, where there was like a provision where any money that was given to charity would get twice deductibility. So what is everyone going to do? Everyone would give, money knowing that it would get twice deducted up until 10% of your gross income. There was another provision allowing for giving, I think it was 1,500 lari to start entrepreneurial businesses, but there was no actual reporting requirement to show that they actually started the business, things like this. So there's a lot of concerns about this. However, grant giving, if we allow grant giving by for-profits, it's kind of, it's a chicken or the egg thing here. I think it'll be good to allow for-profits to give, to have a voice and to give grants, especially if we can create a gold list of essentially approved donors that the government isn't going to fear that they're going to interfere with the political situation in Georgia. So that's all that I have for you. Thank you for your time.
Can we take a few questions?
I have a question.